Kalispera says, good evening, everyone. I hope you've all had enjoying our winter period as Melbourne exists in its own hemisphere. Allow me to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders, past, present, emerging. Welcome to tonight's Dimitri Tsaloumas Memorial Lecture, which will take the form of a panel discussion. This event was originally scheduled in September, but we've pushed it back to November simply because we wanted to ensure the availability of an eclectic range of speakers. Let me also add that this is a joint event with the Greek-Australian Cultural League. I'd also like to thank tonight's sponsor, Helen Nikos and Our Books. This annual event was conceived several years ago, and its aim, apart from honouring the Greek-Australian poet Dimitri Tsaloumas, is to celebrate not just Greek-Australian, but diaspora writing. Before I continue, I invite Kathy Alexopoulos from the Greek-Australian Cultural League to the podium to say a few words.
Thank you, Nikos. Hello, everybody. Lovely to see you. I will start as well. I acknowledge the peoples of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land we stand on, and their continuing connection to land, waters and community. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I also pay respects to our ancestors who have travelled to this land and have toiled for their survival. After Dimitris' death, Dimitri Tsaloumas I'm referring to, in collaboration with the Greek community, L Publishing and the Greek-Australian Cultural League, we began the Dimitri Tsaloumas Memorial Lectures, held as part of the successful and highly informative Greek history and culture seminars. The inaugural lecture took place in 2017 with Vrasida Karali, followed by Michael Tsianikis in 2018, Kostadina Andonis in 2019, and the 20 event, of course, was cancelled due to COVID, but Nikos Papastergiades via Zoom in 2021. And I think everyone was zoomed out by then. Dimitri Tsaloumas in 2022, Angela Costi in 2023, Kostadina Andonis once again in 24, and today, chaired by Andonis Piperoglou, the panel comprising of Nikos Papastergiades, Angela Costi and George Mouratidis, who will explore through their discussion poetry, history and diaspora, echoing the past, poeting from the present. Dimitri Tsaloumas' significance in Greek-Australian literature cannot be overstated. Throughout his life, he received numerous major state and national honours for his poetry and enjoyed the rare privilege of his books selling out, leading to multiple editions. Tsaloumas also held esteemed residences at Oxford and Cambridge universities and was involved to give numerous poetry readings worldwide. Recently, his work gained further recognition in Greece. Now I'm talking of last year, through this book, The Korali, and I think it might be out of print because we tried to get some more. Do we have any more? No. Antigone Kefala was born in the Greek region of Braila in Romania into a family of musicians, and she aspired to become an actor as a child. She was fluent in Romanian, French, Greek and English, and completed an MA in French in New Zealand after arriving there as a teenager. Her family were refugees from Romania following the Soviet Union's occupation, first escaping to Greece and living in refugee camps. Then she moved to Australia in 1959 and lived in inner Sydney until her death in 2022. She began writing seriously in Sydney, inspired by the cosmopolitan urban environment and the city's geography. She only wrote in English, but her extensive reading in French and European modernist writers greatly influenced her work. She has been described as a surrealist writer, But the awareness of the European modernist writing and art has varied among Australian writers and critics. So she was often regarded as a unique rather than part of the modernist literature. She certainly viewed herself within an international literary context. And just a few words about Eleni Nika, who unfortunately sends her apologies for today, for today's presentation due to family matters, and has once again generously donated several books by Dimitri Tsaloumas and Antigone Kefala that are for sale at the counter there. These are collector's items, and I encourage you to purchase any that you might not already own. We thank Eleni for her ongoing support and dedication to promoting Hellenic writers through our publishing, and of course the Greek community, which continues this commitment each year for these important and noteworthy writers and poets who elevate the standards within the Australian literary community. Thank you all very much for attending today and for giving up your time. Thank you.
We're good, Nikos. I think we're good. Can we get cracking? We're good.
Okay, and Diaspora.
All right. Thank you.
All right, I'll leave my thunder out. Please continue, Andonis.
Thank you. So, welcome everyone. Hello. It's good to be here. It's lovely to see familiar faces and new faces. I too, as someone whose mother was born in British Cyprus, would like to acknowledge the Wurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation. It's because of my inheritance, if you will, kind of anti-colonial inheritance, that I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded on these lands. And, you know, we think we should acknowledge, in the context particularly of the form of this space, this building, that always has been and always will be on Aboriginal land. I'm joined tonight by three very important people to me. I have here, I'm going to say it, yes, that tonight, you know, these are three very punkish intellectual interlocutors. Angela Costi, she's a fellow Cypriot and has been a very captivating poet for me that I've become more aware of over the last few years. George Mouratidis, who I've shared many conversations on campus in recent years, is an avid reader and I would say very underground thinker and writer, and someone who I wish was around in my more troubled teenage years. And Nikos Papastergiades here, and a generous, generative mentor to many. And if you had the pleasure, I'm trying to see if there were any familiar faces of being in this room last night for the annual John Berger lecture, is someone who's co-contributed to making, with a chorus of like minds, this community space become just a little bit more proactive in how it can create cultural dialogue. I'm going to give a little introductory talk now, and then I'm going to ask Nikos and Angela and George a few questions. It's going to, we hope, lead to some sharing of poetry in what we could think of as a dialogic exchange, and we hope it's fun, enjoyable, enlightening. We're going to hear the words, I think, of a range, a kind of a symphony, if you will, of different types of voices and how these voices intersect with the politics of history and diaspora. Guiding us this evening are some questions, if you will, that very much are in my head as someone who's been thinking very seriously ever since I started my position at the University of Melbourne about how to historicise diaspora. And these questions, simply put, are therefore about how do you make, do, act, practice history, and what's involved in the making of history as a craft. How do we tell the stories of our past? How do we grapple with difficult histories? How can we make meaning from the many displacements and ruptures that are identifiable in our diasporic heritages, within ourselves, within our family, across our streets? What are the modes by which we can recover neglected stories? How can we make meaning of the past from, say, taboos or the unsayable? How can we salvage senses of possibility from unutterable origins? In asking these questions, I also just want to share that as a formally trained historian, I'm sort of well versed in what we would call, inverted commas, archival research. And I'm familiar then with accessing dusty boxes, cracking open files, flicking my thumb through decrepit folders. And in this, I've become confident in reading the plethora of materials that are curated by the state. For the state and its institutions, right, are pretty scrupulous at archival work. And I've come to see my interaction, right, with this sort of archival residue as a type of intimate relationship I'm building with this place we call Australia. But it's not the state stories, right, that I want to access. I want to access our stories, our diasporic stories. And so, as someone say, committed to the practice of history from the bottom up, right? I wish to recover the stories, say, of our forebears, of our kin, of our community, that hover on the periphery, right? On the edge, away, say, from the comfort of a kind of cozy center. So to access this periphery, I've become increasingly accustomed to seeing what I would call a kind of poetry-history nexus, right? That is the interplay between the past through active poeting. And I particularly, just as we heard from Kathy earlier, like to then thank tonight the ever so kind, ever so generous, but also sharply critical and active kind of the lifelong career put in by Helen Nikos. Helen's commitment to Greek writers in Australia is, in my view, unmatched. Think about commitment and what that means. In 1992, she became an independent publisher, founding what she calls her venture in life, Owl Publishing, named after Athena's wise owl. And it's because of Helen and a kind of generative intellectual style that I've become increasingly committed to understanding the crucial need to preserve the creative outputs of Diaspora as a means then to access messy, layered, often unnoticed histories. So in writing off some of our publications, let me just introduce you again to three poets. Well, we heard about two just earlier. We also have one in the room with us who will be channeling our thinking, right? So the first is Dimitri Tsaloumas, of which a lecture is named after tonight. And so in 1983, a year before what has become a kind of heated debate in Australian sort of 80s history, of kind of sometimes called the Blaney debates about multiculturalism, something important occurred. And it was the emergence, maybe the foundation, if you will, of what has been termed the multicultural literature. Queensland University Press published their first bilingual publication, a collection of poems by Tsaloumas called The Observatory. You can check it out on the table over there, right? And it went on to win the National Book Council Award. Defying easy categorization, Tsaloumas' work keeps at arm's length from concrete reality. Engaging with Greekness in theme and style, he does not concern himself with matters of, say, the Greek community, nor to Melbourne per se, where he lives since 1952. His works instead sort of mediate between deep loss, nostalgia, we might talk about that a bit later, melancholy, and all in a kind of excessive pessimistic outlook that I think works best, right, when we observe from the painful position of exile. In 1994, Tsaloumas won the Patrick White Award. In 2016, he passed. Antigone Kefala, born in Romania to Greek parents, escaped to Greece, then to New Zealand, on which he was on the first refugee ship accepted by that country after the war, and then came to Australia in 1959. She was prolific. She was a writer. But she was a writer forever being defined as foreign, as migrant, not quite Australian enough. In 1973, her first Australian publication was titled The Alien. Let me share with you a few of her own words on arriving to this country, and maybe just take note of her ability to capture a mood. Australia. We entered Sydney Harbour, a shimmering morning. The colours on the rock at the gap were warm apricot. The sun was coming down on the waters, the whole landscape shimmering, overflowing with light, with heat, with movement. I was suddenly released from the greenness, she's talking about New Zealand, the rain, the wind, released, at least for a moment, from my inner problems. My past in Romania, in Greece, came back as a meaningful experience in a landscape that has similar resonances. Sydney seemed alive with people, activity, and intellectual excitement. In 2022, the same year that she passed, she won the Patrick White Award. Which brings me to my third wonderful poet who's sitting with us. This is from the back of your book, so you can't pin me down. An urban poet, a poet of cafes, of ochre, of workers, of wogs working the cogs of time and pace, a poet of performance, Pio, Fitzroy's filthy finest, was born in Katerini in 51, the same year my dad was born. He and his family found no safe haven in Bonegilla. He listens to the streets. He's playful with his wordplay, and in doing so, he captures the vitality of everyday tongues. So listen here to a snippet from his poem, The Welcher. Italians, Greeks, Yugoslavs, and Hungarians may have wanted to crawl through the nearest keyhole out of Australia, and the Prime Minister of Australia in 1990 may very well be Nick Papadopoulos. But while they were at Bonegilla, that hot Mediterranean blood of theirs was going to pump up Australia. Because Australia, after the war, wanted all the industrial cannon fodder it could get. And wogs for cogs sounded just fan-bloody-tastic. So Pio received the Patrick White Award last year. He's still with us, right? Woo! Okay, so this is a setup to say to you that three important poets have been recognised, if you will, in the sort of broader Australian literary canon and landscape. And they're all different Greeks, and they're all writing with different registers. Nikos, I would say, maybe I'm wrong in trying to put things in this defined generational context, but I see you as someone who grew up knowing, aware of these poets, particularly Kefala and Tsaloumas. And I'm also aware that you wrote your honours thesis, 1984, is that correct, in which they featured heavily? Mm-hmm. Can you just share with us then the first moments these poets started to speak to you?
Okay. the crucial connector for me was an artist called Yorgos Michalakakis. And right at the beginning of my decision to do a dissertation on migrant writing, I met Yorgos. And coincidentally, when I went to my supervisor at the University of Melbourne, I said, "Oh, look, I've got two topics for an honours thesis." He goes, "What's the first?" I said, "Well, the first one's an extension of an essay I wrote for you, which I got a H1 for. It's about the desert and the way in which its symbolism impacts on Australian painting and poetry. And I'm fascinated by this void in the middle of our consciousness." He said, "And what's the other one?" I said, "Well, the other one, I don't know what it's about. It's about migrants. It's about my family, my identity. I don't know where to begin with it, but maybe something about migration and identity and culture." He goes, and I'll never forget this. He just says, "Do that one." There was no reason to say that. There was no archive to work with. There was no reference points, no canonical figure at that point. This is end of '83, right? Tsaloumas hasn't won the prize yet. And then by coincidence, I met Yorgos Michalakakis. And the first thing he said to me is, there's a poetry reading in Northcote or somewhere. There was a little amphitheatre in the middle of a park that had been set up as a pop-up performance event. And Tsaloumas was reading. And at the end of the performance, everyone was clapping and doing the usual thing. It was a beautiful night. And Tsaloumas came straight up to Michalakakis and wanted to know his response. And Yorgos was a former active member of the Greek community. He was a successful artist who had shows in Pinakotheka, one of the most elite conceptual art galleries in Richmond. He had been to art school in Athens, but his mother thought that was, the work of the devil, and he had to leave to escape her clutches and all her, crosses and things. But he comes to Australia as an artist, fully intellectually formed, with this very strong aesthetic, but a very powerful Marxist aesthetic as well. And he takes me along to this event, and Tsaloumas, of all the people in the amphitheatre, zooms in on Yorgos with this, hawk-like intensity, and really wanted to know what George's response was. He was completely uninterested in everybody else in the space. And George was frank and critical, because Tsaloumas was apolitical and George was completely political. And but George recognised the aesthetic tautness and the rigour and the thoughtfulness in Tsaloumas's work. And so he both appreciated that and was very critical of the lack of context building, let's say. It was a beautiful encounter, and for me it was very stimulating. And I'll never forget how George then took me to one event after another to meet Panagiotis, Dina, who's in the room, George Vasilakopoulos, who's in the room, Pio, who was very active at the time with Migrant 7 and 9 to 5 magazines. And in those days there were also a lot of poetry cafes where poets would perform in the cafes on a Sunday afternoon and evening. And so Pio would get up and perform like a machine gun, mow the whole room down with his words. And I can remember one poem which was about a social worker talking to a client, a kid in Fitzroy, and the social worker says to the kid, "Just hang in there, mate, hang in there." And the kid says, "What the fuck would you know about hanging in there?" And I also know, on the contrast, the other poem I can remember by heart is by Yorgos Vasilakopoulos, because when I met Michalakakis, he was going to reboot this journal he was producing. He was producing a journal called Chronico, which started in 78 or 79? 78, the first issue. And the second issue was 79 and 80. And then in 84 was the fourth and fifth issues, started again. There was a couple of years where it had stopped. And we were experimenting a little bit more with the form of the journal. Because at that stage, Melbourne was also producing Art and Text, which was a very internationally influential art magazine. High theory, very cool conceptual art, etc. And there was a sort of response to Art and Text, which was led by Peter Lysiodis and Stan Anson, which was called Art and a Texter, which was a satirical version on Art and Text. And that really was a bit of a takedown on Art and Text. And I sort of said to Yorgo, we need to go somewhere in the middle of these two journals. And we produced a new format, much more slick, much more cool, elegant style. And we had a Peter Lysiodis photo on the cover of that issue. And in one of the issues, I think it was the first one that I was working with George, there was a poem by Vasilakopoulos here, whole page. In fact, there might have even been 2 pages, all blank and just 2 words. Erastes palestes. Beautiful haiku. And so this was a very fertile period, a period where, Chronikos was produced out of a Greek printing company in Collingwood. And, George and Peter and Nikos Kypreos, I think, was involved a little bit as well. Were very, George actually did everything. The rest of us just did a little bit. And it was very fertile time, incredibly fertile time, thinking about the intersections between art and politics. And because multiculturalism was a hot topic, it wasn't as ignored as it is now. And also migrants were really pioneering the rethinking of what Australian identity could be. And not just trying to fit in, but refit the place. Yeah. So there was a sort of reconfiguration of the possible rather than an assimilation into the necessary.
You remind, one of the things that Pio and Collective Effort Press, and one of, it's escaped me, your sister's name? Thalia. Thalia's work in visual poetry. And there's this brilliant visual poem, multicultural. 2 symbols, and then you have to think with the visual image through these symbols. Very imaginative, very creative, very active time. If we could just switch then from this world that you're engaging with to the translation of that into the academic sphere. So I have a book here called Striking Chords with a very, peculiar 90s cover.
Yeah, that's another Peter Lysiodis cover.
Okay. And Multicultural Literary Interpretations, edited by Sneža Gunev and Katarina Olongi. And in here, Nikos has an essay. And the essay asks an interesting question, writing off a conference that Nikos says he went to. I imagine the conference to be here, but it probably wasn't. But I imagine in a similar forum, right? What is Greek Australia? Were you there? Did you run it? Konstantina ran the conference, right? So what is Greek Australian literature? And Nikos unravels this sort of very quickly in the opening, right? There's these debates. This is Greek, it has to be like this. These are the bounds in which we define what this is. At the same time as these debates are happening within our communities, there's an interesting sort of academic shift in thinking and theorizing and trying to understand the hyperconnectivity that's occurring in our world, in our society. And this sort of word gets bandied around called hybrid, all right? And Nikos sort of makes then a claim then that sitting in the space of the hyphen Greek Australian, sitting in that sort of unknown connective tissue space is a productive space to be in. And it therefore can be Greek and it can be Australian and it can be all in one. But in that essay, so we'll transition perhaps to Kefala, right? So in that essay, you explore this theme by looking at the Kefala, a different voice, a different poet.
Yeah. Kefala was very austere as a person. She was very severe, and she did write a lot, but her words were very carefully chiseled. And every single thought was processed and reprocessed and processed. And you know, when she gave you, and she often would send me letters, and which were beautifully hand typed, and she would include a few poems. They were immaculate. You know, they're absolutely exquisite works. And so, you know, the interesting thing about Antigone is, as you rightly said, she wasn't Australian enough for the Australian public and the Australian literary scene. She, for instance, won the Patrick White Award at the end of her life, and not once in her long career, and she was a major figure, a very visible figure in many, many ways because of her role in the Australia Council. Not once was she invited to participate in the Adelaide Writers' Festival. I mean, this is criminal. And so she was, you know, highly appreciated amongst certain writers. She was like a writer's writer. And within the Greek community, she was revered. And so the point of that conference was, you know, for me, was to go beyond the stereotypical claims about identity and belonging. Because here was a figure like Antigone, and like some of us who didn't fit easily into any category. And so, you know, the beginning of that essay sort of says, for some people they wanted Greek Australian literature to be Greek writers in Australia, or writers writing about Greece, but in other words, the nation dominated your identity. And the reason why I focused on the hyphen is because at that time we were rethinking a lot about how our identity was formed, not from a particular place only, but also from a process, the journey. And in one of Antigone's poems, it says, "In dreams begins the journey." The moment you recognize that ethereal and oniric element of the way in which your identity is already constructed in this abstract space, then it doesn't fit into any, you know, I come from and I belong to. So you are always in a process. And in artists like Antigone, and to a lesser extent Dimitri Tsaloumas, there was a trauma in terms of what was lost. And that trauma was never going to be healed and reconciled, either through nostalgia or through some sort of metaphysical synthesis. It was just a permanent cut. And the question, therefore, was, how do you live with that cut, that trauma? What happens after a cut? You're left with fragments, not the whole, a piece of the whole. And then you have to reconstitute, not the whole of that cosmology and mythology and domestic arrangement that you had in your traditional family structure, etc., from the home place, but you had to reconstruct it out of the pieces that you now find and have carried with you and make on the journey. So those three elements have to come into dynamic interplay. What you've carried with you, what you find, and what you make. And so Antigone was a very powerful example of someone who, you know, to the Greeks she was foreign, a little bit too Romanian, a little bit too French. To the Australians, she was definitely not Australian. And so she only really felt at home when she was in the company of strangers, like other artists from other parts of the world.
I use these 3 R's a lot with my students when teaching diaspora and histories. Rework, retain, reject, and it's happening simultaneously. I'm going to switch to you, Angela. Your poetry has moved me quite a lot in the last few years, particularly because of my Cypriotness. You know, it's very challenging to think about bounded notions of Greekness and being attentive to the specificity of our place, of our regions. You're sort of maybe a generation somewhat, little tad younger, maybe not, maybe the same age as Nikos. No, much younger.
I look younger, mate.
But within that is I wanted to ask you, right? So you can say, this is our sort of academic setup to give you a historical context, but these two figures here are poets, and they think very seriously about their use of words, and they use their use of words to theorize and understand, I would say, historicize difficult past or unapproachable pasts. So particularly within the context of Cyprus, I want to just sort of open that up to say, coming to poetry for you, has this sort of attempt to understand a past that is not yours always been guiding you?
Does this work? Yes. A couple of things I want to say. One is that very recently I found out that 96% of me is my DNA is Cyprus. So it's not Greece, it's not Turkey, it's not Australian. It's Cyprus, 96%. That's a lot. And so that for me confirmed this obsessiveness that I've had since the very beginning of this whole journey of writing. And so I feel professionally to be engaged as a writer in late 93. And then 94 was my first poem that was published. And from the very beginning, it seemed that I wanted to somehow capture those stories that I was told orally. We often sort of think about the stories that we're told as we're growing up, and whether we see those stories as we study in various ways, primary, secondary and tertiary, and we don't see those stories, and we certainly see them misunderstood as we begin to research those institutionalised archives. And I just felt that I needed to, I suppose, find a way to creatively document those stories, because certainly my parents, grandparents and great-grandparents were not given the opportunity to in any way contribute to the archives. So I see that a lot also with, because over the last few weeks in preparation for today, I familiarised myself with Tsaloumas' work again, Kefala's work, and I've always been aware of Pio's work. They're completely different, but there is a commonality in that they are endeavouring to capture something of their experience. They're endeavouring to, particularly in 24 hours, he's recreating those incredible spaces where oral storytelling is taking place. It's ephemeral. If it's not captured, it's lost. So I think I'm similarly doing that with my work.
I asked you to maybe share one or two of either Tsaloumas or Kefala's poems that have spoken to you. Do you mind doing that?
Yeah, I'll do all three, but shall we begin with Tsaloumas? So I've got Tsaloumas, his poem, I don't know if people are aware, I know people would be in this space, The Sick Barber. It's a very long poem. It speaks to me because it's a very strong portrait poem. He spent some time, as my understanding, he spent some time in Patmos. He was sick, and so was the barber that he went to. And I like the details in this poem and the precision in it. And so I'll just read parts of it. It was hard to get a copy, so thank you, Dimitris. Dimitris sent me a copy of this. Now. The sick barber. At the top of Batmos, 32 years ago and more, one winter's day. The north wind, bleak, teeth clenching, sinks the headlands in cataracts of spume, falls on the breakwater and bursting forth rushes uphill, screaming and howling and threatening the island's lid, thrusting the cowering sun into bolted courtyards. You daren't risk the sunless alleys where women round the corners in full sail with billowing skirts, and monks perch perilously on the monastery's white battlements. On days like this, drunkards' noses turn blue, doors slam and sounds are heard in the empty houses of the rich. From time to time, a fishing boat sinks, drowning captain and crew, and in the coffee house, they talk about the loss amid the rising bitterness from steaming sage teacups. So I'll go into, it's a very long poem, so I'm going towards the end of it. And this is about the barber himself. But steadily and skillfully the scissors would discipline the customer's gaze, shutting out irrelevant observation, clippings and dandruff on the cloth spread over hidden hands. The much pressed trousers with the yellow stain at the fly, the spots at the bottom of the tie, and the ancestral watch chain. A whiff of incense would emerge from his chest as he bent over, but when he shook the towel, his huge puzzled eyes would nail you over the pale edge of his nose, while the two most consumptive fingers would stroke his small moustache. First one side, then the other, the small cough stubbornly suppressed in the palm. Good health to you, Mr. Tsaloumas, your good health. Oh no, one last bit. Sorry, I'll end just one. This is the final bit of it. Our good health indeed, now that a spiteful north wind pushes us against his glass door one day on the winter side of the world. But we wait in vain for the stairs to creak. The barber is laid up, curled on his bed with wood-stiff fingers. The barber won't get up again, not now, not in spring, however warm the days. The pretty serenades and the waves of the Danube hang now from the nail along with the washed-out smells above the basin stand with the barber's shop debris. Dirty lather, stale bristles, cigarette butts. Further along, on another nail, the striped cloth, greasy where it fastens round the neck, and a shudder runs down the spine of time.
Thank you.
Read better by an actor, but yeah, that one grabbed me, that poem in particular.
Well, I'll open to George, and then I know the two of you have a little plan to do a little bit of bouncing, which I would love to do. Did you bring any poems?
Yeah, I did.
Oh, okay.
Oh, cool.
We'll do a lot of poem bouncing. Yeah.
Poem for poem.
Okay. So again, like a little like moving back again, George. Right. So it's like a little bit younger. Poetry comes to you how?
Quite honestly, it was music, like listen to the radio. And it's kind of two ways. I think part of it was a realization retrospectively that, like a lot of us, it was, you're sort of born into a household, migrant household. The radio was on all the time. 3 Epsilon Alpha, back in the 80s, SBS radio. So that was always around. And then, when you get older, you get into your early teens and music, English language music starts to matter to you. You start to take note of the rhythms and the, assonance and the shape and the mouthfeel of the words. when you're seeing them or when you're listening to them, you know, you get your inner ear working. And the first sort of poems that I wrote in earnest were rewriting song lyrics of songs that I liked. So that way you're kind of given this form, and then you like, well, you know, okay, I want to be a bit ambitious and rewrite Bob Dylan or something like that, you know. Of course it sucked. But, and then it was something that was just completely private. I never thought of it you know, growing up where I grew up, like a lot, you know, like a lot of us, working class, migrant community, industrial estate. It was either, you know, I mean, even the idea of university was like this sort of golden light over the horizon somewhere where that poetry lives over there, you know. It's, and at school, poetry was something you learned by heart, either in English class, you know, Shakespeare's, you know, the canon, Shakespeare's great, you're crap, you know, or, you know, 25 Martiu, learning poems by heart at Greek school. So poetry was this tight, sort of very, like a corseted thing to me. On the one hand, on the other hand, it was, you know, listening to Bithikotis in Yanni Ritso, you know, and that was something that, as I grew into political consciousness, it's like, well, of course, you know, it was around me all the time. It was sort of given voice as I got into university and had a kind of political consciousness, not in an ideological sense, but in terms of you find out pretty early who's for real and who's full of shit, you know, who controls the narrative and who's on the peripheries of this narrative, you know. And with this kind of idea of politics as this lived thing, and of course, you know, I grew up in, you know, Socialist Party of Australia, Demokrito, that kind of ekigalochithika, right? So with this political consciousness, how does this relate to poetry? I mentioned this to somebody in my Greek class in first year, possibly Costa Kalimnio. I remember the day that I met him. It was like, I mean, he had this beautiful paisley shirt on, and it was like silk, and the sun was coming in through old art, and it was just like, sort of like a stained glass window of a kind of saint, you know, Ayos Kalimnios, kind of like that, you know. And I thought, like, I want to know this guy. And then we're talking with another friend of ours, and the friend goes, oh, you know, you're into poetry. Oh, have you heard of Poe? Like, I knew Poe is like Li Po. I thought he was talking about Li Bai, like the Chinese Tang Dynasty poet. Poe, who's this Poe? And there was, around that time, there was a sort of, back when Readings was a radical-ish bookshop. Forget now, like, you know, there's like a tunnel from Readings to Wheeler Centre and, you know, freaking Gerald's Bar, you know, or whatever, like a wine bar kind of type of situation. It's all, yeah, it's all lifestyle-y bullshit, right? But then it was like, I mean, you could walk in and get Gregory Corso's poetry at Readings, unheard of now, you know. But there was a copy of 24 Hours, like this big doorstop tome. And between lectures, I used to go in there and just read a bit every day. And it's like, holy shit, what the fuck is this? You know, like, it was just, my world, just like all the sort of Greek radio came together with, you know, people, you know, gambling in the back of Cafenea in Thomastown, the one on the corner of Spring Street and High Street. I know the one, my theories used to go there at the back. All this world, it's like, hang on, this has artistic value? You know, I thought it was like, you know, forsooth, I know not why I am so sad. You know, which, yeah, that has artistic, you know, what a piece of work is man, how noble in reason. All that kind of stuff. Of course it has artistic value, but it didn't speak to me, you know. And when you're young, it's like, I want to see myself in these things. So when you're older, you can kind of make the aesthetic decisions, what matters, what doesn't. And so for me, the catalytic moment was 24 Hours. Of course, it took me 20 years to be able to speak to Pio, because it's like, oh, man, okay, I've got a lot of work to do to qualify to speak to this guy. you know. So, and then by that time it was like, hang on, Pio. And then I was reading Allen Ginsberg at that time as well. So I was like, okay, they kind of speak to each other here. Okay, what's going on? So you have high art meets idiomatic, idiosyncratic details of life, you know, with boots on the ground. So to me, in the middle of all this, there was, you know, Antigone Kefala, Dimitri Tsaloumas, to me were mentioned just like in the same way as Shakespeare was mentioned. They're great. I read some bits, like, I mean, some of the books that, you know, I have on display here that I got borrowed from the library. I remember seeing those books and kind of reading them, and I thought, okay, yeah, these are okay. You know, I was more interested in, like, you know, Varnali and Rizzo and people like that, you know, in my sort of poetic education. And in all this time, it's like, how was I to know that, like, one suburb over in Lalor, that's where Angela was living? You know, and just like Andonis, just like, you know, God, you know, later when we met, like 20 years later, like, where were you when I was like dying? You know, like, of course, I mean, I didn't make too much of an effort to kind of find all the other weirdo freakazoids, right? But they were probably there. But then it's just like, oh man, you know, being the oldest son as well, you kind of like, everything lands on you. You have to be the leader. You have to, you know, break through and do something. But at the same time, I'm like, I'm a bit confused. I don't know. I needed somebody to mentor me as well in this. And it took me, honestly, you know, when Angela was kind of, you know, 1994, killing it, you know, doing poetry readings. Poetry readings is something other people do. You know, I'd fill notebooks, chuck it in your locker, forget about it. It's not going to see the light of day, doesn't matter. People like me is like, you know, shut up and clean our toilets and wash our dishes, you know.
Okay, so
you know,
can I just add that you actually remind me of last year, Nikos, when you talked with Christos Solkas about your book, actually. And you said something that I related to quite a lot, and it's why I have such respect for these poets. You basically said, Christos, I envy you. You have chosen to engage in a life of art that my mother told me is not possible to do. And Pio, I remember asking you on High Street at some bar that something was happening some night, and I asked you, Pio, how did you become a poet? What allowed that? And you, with a pause and a swig maybe, you then said, I asked my father, why do you gamble? Right? And I remember this distinctly as a kind of way that there is something very important to recognize here, I think, and to say that taking that choice to write and to live out the complexities of these lives is a very courageous act. And last night at the John Berger lecture, we heard a really interesting framing of courage as, if I can remember it right, as, you know, moving forward with fear.
It was fear, but you're facing the right direction.
Right, yeah, okay. Moving in the right direction, fearful. So with that, right, maybe we'll just go first to you, George. Do you mind reading one of your own poems?
my own.
Yes, please.
All right. I'll have to kind of fast forward a bit here. Let's see.
And then we'll have one by you. Did you bring one of your own, Nikos?
No, I brought Antigone poem.
Okay.
I'm wondering, with Pio's permission, I might read one of his Upstairs Cafe from 24 Hours, because I think that sort of, for me, resonates on many, many levels and resonates with what George was saying about his upbringing.
Can I make a parenthesis between
Please.
Pio and Antigone and Dimitri, unlike Christo and Tina, that generation all had day jobs. You know, Paya, you were a draftsman, I think. Dimitri taught at a high school. Antigone worked at the Australia Council.
She's the first multicultural officer.
That's correct. But there were, at that time there was an unhelpful division between Dimitri and Antigone and people like Paya. Paya was seen as the Ratbag Street political artist, and they were seen as the more aesthetic, elevated artists. It was a completely unhelpful, and the people themselves, the artists, didn't see the world that way. And I know this for a fact because Dimitri came and stayed with me in Cambridge when he was visiting the other professor in Oxford, and I had him in my house for a week. And at one stage we went back and forth to London, and we had been talked out. I had no more to talk to him, and he had nothing more to tell me, and we were just exhausted on the train. And I said to him, and I had one of your poems, one of your book of poems. I think it was the Fitzroy poems. I said, read this, shut up, in other words. And he starts reading somewhere between King's Cross Station and Cambridge, and he starts chuckling, and he was loving it. And at that point, the moment he said, then I went back to that scene in Northcote in that amphitheatre, because he was reading in Greek. And he was reading his early poems, which he wrote while he was living in bedsits and old men's homes in St Kilda. And he was describing the squabbles between the Yugoslavs and the Italians, and his attention to people's language and his attention to the slang, even though it was done in a very aesthetic way, was not that far apart from the way in which Paya would play with the intersections of dialects and the visceral versions of language. So I just wanted to sort of add this little bridge.
Thank you. Yeah.
Sorry, now back to you guys.
We'll go George, then Angela, then Nikos.
All right, cool. All right. This came out of I don't do preambles, but this is more of a writing exercise I do with my creative writing students. That was, of course, no PowerPoints, no laptops, no phones, no nothing like that in the class. Notepad, paper, totally granola, right? So it's just like, we got to the week, we were talking about spontaneous composition and sketching. So get your books, get your pens, go out on Lygon Street for 45 minutes and sketch what you see, right? So naturally, I thought, well, I'm not going to ask them to do something that I'm not prepared to do myself. So this is the result of that kind of exercise. It's called All the Young Dudes. All the young dudes, 4 for sure loaded college kids, athletic gear straight from Protein Gym Flex, striding down Faraday, verge of crotch grab. One trips another in white cap in jest, all as white as it gets. Grammar school, Adam's apple put on deep voice, big fat words thud as they turn down Cardigan towards probably Clyde for more jug beer flex talk, in shorts, legs, hairless and pale blue as candied stragaglia, chickpeas, in big bins in old Dahlia's down High Street with baby pink, yellow, white, next to pistachios and pasatebo, roasted pumpkin seeds, bulging fruit and veg, plastic bags full of them, in boxy vinyl shopping carts, brown and navy green, white plastic wheels on polished concrete, next to 10-litre drums of Atlas olive oil, and piles of Nanda pasta, white letters in blue diamond label, ads during Greek variety show morning on Sunday, Lakis Chalkias sing strolling on pier, harbour wind flapping his long points, everything dream, ocean blue, swagman showgirls, purple, pink and crimson plumed, Grandes vendita, megalo, megalo, megalo saba papagalo. Before wrestling on one channel over, above open tilted baskets of delicious soily salty renga. What's that? Smoked herring? Best with fasolada bean soup in big fat olives in steam fog winter kitchen on Saturday early afternoon, school holidays, green eye of blinking 50s radio through brownly warm of outside who cares gloom. A buck, a cupped handful of in a white paper bag of them, salt grits pasatempo at soccer next day. Same old dude at all the matches selling, also kuluria, sesame crusted bread rings, threaded on a long branch slung over his shoulder, my favourite. And the hands of the dudes in the stands go up and bloom out, nah, at the ref, cursing his clan to 5 generations, one for each finger. Old Olympic Village in Heidelberg, Bell Street, with overgrown gravel athletics track from 56 games. Red slop on runners, in the rain lovingly cleaned up, went back home Sunday evening death weight. Wait, no school tomorrow, holidays, nothing to do. Walk to Lalo shops, down Malaluka, downhill, cross Loose Plank Bridge, over Tomo Creek, Darebin, don't know the real name, and up again past orange brick wall of Will You Live to See the Dawn spray painted, with rushed black rays of scribbled yellow sun through red swirl clouds, to library opposite Coles New World on May Road. Old cement sheet portable then with kick holes. Borrow same book, Discovering the Ancient Past, with shirtless gleaming Aztec in plaits, holding a wooden mallet on the cover, staring through me to the future. Then cake box, still there, shit now. For trifle cup, jam red, custard yellow, lime green, to share on the bus. Either that or crinkle cut chips in paper newsprint cup, hot chips tasty from takeaway. Old bread roll chunks strewn on non-sleep steel steps of red striped white bus that are always slippery, with kids and grannies always stacking and yelling and swearing at the driver as though he was the one who'd made it rain. Freezing, streetlight orange, paper piss yellow, can't see the line anymore.
Thank you. Beautiful. Angela?
Yeah, so 24 hours. When I first came across this book, we're talking today about resonances and things that reverberate and echo, and the family in this is, I felt that there were similarities with mine, even though certainly I wasn't, thank goodness my family didn't land in Bonagilla, but I suppose Lalor had its, and Riverwood. So
oh yeah,
Riverwood was where I actually was born, and that's I visited that very recently, and it hasn't changed, and it's a bit like.
Neither has Lalor.
It's worse than Lalor actually, in terms of struggle and the rigours of trying to find decent work. But again, this is a long one, but I think it really, for me, captured the essence of what it meant to be Greek, with all its nuances within an Australian context, and it also gave us another language, that in-between language that I find really fascinating. So, upstairs cafe. I walk up the stairs into the cafe. My father's there, gambling. I go over. He puts his hand on my back and I kiss him. He tells me to sit down next to him and orders me a coffee. I say, no, I want to read the paper and do the crossword. All right, he says, opos thelis. And I go over and sit down over near the back window. Manoli, who's left his wife behind to look after the milk bar, comes in. He sits down next to Dumsis, the real estate agent, under the TV. Mila, gentlemen, and starts playing. He sees me and waves. Nick Vindinopoulos' dad's there also. He throws down a card with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth and checks his watch. On the wall, there's an old picture frame of Queen Elizabeth II dressed up in the pinks and reds of the 50s with a blue sash, the Greek flag and a calendar of a Greek soccer team, Hellas, I think. The blokes over on the table next to me start arguing. I love listening to them. Varton, but amathelis varton, anikse, mitrebese, τι σε νοιάζει, άτε πουστικά να μη παίξουμε. Δεν ξέρεις τι σου γίνεται. Εγώ πληρώνω τα γαμημένα. Μας εφάγε bloody thing. Βάρτον, βλέπε το παιχνίδι τε. Εδώ είσαι πουτ. Μίλα Ιγγλέζικα. Γαμόδο. And so on. What I love about it, it continues and continues, and it's actually quite tender. There's a real connection with the father in this, and at the end of this long poem, there's a picture of three men, and I would imagine one of them would be his father. So I like the dark, I like the hard consonants of the language, and I love the juxtaposition between the hard consonants and the tenderness in it. And I felt there was nostalgia, but it made me understand my father better, who was a gambler. So that's. I recommend this one in particular. I know he's got three others, but this really is very evocative and very emotional.
If we want to compare it to the canon, it's Ulysses in Fitzroy.
Nikos, do you want to share a poem of Kefala?
Yeah, I'd like to read a poem from Antigone. I've also chosen a long poem, but I'm only going to read 2 of the 5 parts of the poem. The poem's called Thirsty Weather. To find our measure, exactly, not the echo of other voices, the present growing out of our lungs like a flower, with a smell that we have retraced through our veins, some dark, secret smell that will bloom when the hour has struck. An animal smell, reminiscent of blood, the world's scent. Something of us must remain in this light that keeps on reflecting. We have struck it with knives and were given the shadow of knives in return. Fountains with springs in the air, and we drinking our death in small mouthfuls. They were stealing your time, you unaware, walking by the seaside, your hands full of imagined scents, while at the tables under the trees with the fumes of the charcoals and the herbs, they were serving light, stones and light with the water. Blood everywhere, frozen and the wind grinding its finely to a golden power that settled like down on a young face. If only you knew, in those ordered Sunday afternoons, the clock chiming in the quiet streets, the rocks warm like skin, and the quay newly bathed, as if a body raising from sleep, still self-sufficient, that you have been marked.
Thank you. Okay. I want to begin to wrap things up by thinking about diaspora here and history, hence kind of riding on tonight's theme. We've been, if you will, sort of poeting. As I'm teaching diaspora, there's a very visible generational sort of need that I'm seeing in the classrooms that someone like Nikos has been seeing for much longer than me. To inherit a diasporic culture means that you're well versed in translation, negotiation, and through that an adaptation. And I've been thinking about a kind of spectrum, if you will, between, and I really want to emphasize, I do not mean this in a left or right politics, okay? But this sort of spectrum of this human desire to conserve, to preserve. In fact, you could say that that's some of our best qualities as human beings in terms of our survival. To keep things that work. Right? And then there's the reality of change, right? Of progress. That culture is not static, it doesn't stay still, it is forever in a process. Right? And so giving attention to the creative output of diaspora, to cultures that are forever in that perpetual dialogue of translation, negotiation, adaptation, I would think helps us deal with that tension between the conserving and the progress within ourselves, family, community, nation. We're still, this has been a crazy 12 months of global politics. We are still, no matter how many memorials we do to try and conserve and hold and commemorate, we're still doing pretty horrible things. So I share this, and I want to kind of take a little switch and a turn here to say we're good Greek Australians on a Thursday night here in the Ganotita, right? But my switch here is to say I would like you to share poems by non-Greeks who speak to you. And what I'm saying and why I want to do this is because there is something quite interestingly, almost universal, I would say, about being part of a culture that is versed in this translation, negotiation, adaptation. That it speaks across cultural divides. It's not a Greek or Australian thing. Right?
Okay. All right. So, I mean, I was talking to former neighbour of mine, actually, Thomastown, just before, and we were just talking about, well, where does diasporic poetry come in? And kind of saying, well, this hyphen or this, we talk about hybridity, we talk about the hyphen, we talk about liminality and whatever, but the kind of space between that is in many ways not negotiated fully is we've gone from Tahorafia to university in one generation. Some people can see that as success, as progress, as integration, as making it or whatever. But in that jump, there's a whole lot of stuff we haven't reckoned with yet, that we're still reckoning with. And poetry is part of that process. So as we talk about, of course, every community has its stuff. And sometimes we reflect each other. This is, the aesthetics of how I address trauma. How do you address, into transgenerational trauma, or you want to call it that? And this is why I've chosen Nam Le and some selections from his book, 36 Ways to Write a Vietnamese Poem. And of course, diasporic poetry just becomes sometimes a bit of a formula like slam poetry, touch this, touch this, touch this, touch this. There's your diasporic poem. Anyway, so Nam Le. 1. Diasporic. In English, mind you, you dink I righty yiknami, shame on you. It was your violence dumbed me, smeared me, reaved me. Your war, I don't remember and don't let you forget, moved me from place and sufficiency, from everything I didn't know, I would have known, you would have known. This place meant everything to me before the power went home. Shame on me. What do I know? What Vietnamese in me could fit in a poem? 4. Egypt, all-encompassing. You can't go far wrong with violence. You'll go far, my boy. You'll cross oceans, my man. Start with the fall, go back or forth, through bombs or boats, across all the killing fields of thought. You can't make it up because it's all yours, by blood, by right, by wrong done to your blood. Hold to trauma, even if it never happened to you. You may claim it. Your blood contains it. What happened to them, your parents, theirs, their kin, who don't talk about it because of what happened to them, is yours to take and to tell. Their harm, your hurt. You may write it, for it is written in the very walls of your cells.
Angela.
Because I haven't read any of these, I'm wondering whether I could propose.
Some of yours.
Yeah, and
Please,
those ones
please.
where maybe the very first one of mine to get published, which gives you an idea of the
Crazy.
so it's,
Please.
the tension between the older generation and the younger generation. It's bilingual. I had a very soft spot for my yaya. She features everywhere. She's the one that did the Lefkaridiga, the Cypriot embroidery. But she had expectations of me, so this is called Visiting Yaya. Mia mera nasedo pandremeni. It's not that easy, Yaya. Our language of marriage collides with her constant lament, my peevish reply. It's our Antipodean anthem. Still, I'm always welcomed by her happy tears at the door, hoisted on walking frame. She insists on coffee and guluragia, which she manages to make. I sit near her, sipping dark brew. One of my hands is covered by hers. She marvels at the contrast of skin, saying hers were never so fine. Her sweetheart and my bapul is now several years dead. There's only one unmarried grandchild and only one event to look forward to. I tell her about my wish to travel, to study. She interjects. Reluctantly, I nod my head. Personal desires can be shared with the right husband. The finale is always hers. Griwara, Broduna Bethano. I leave her, still feeling the weight of her hands, of her death warning, and me unwed. Australian Multicultural Book Review back then, even
I've got that.
in the 90s, it was hard to get your poems published if they were bilingual. So it's different now, but it was hard back then.
Sort of.
Thank you. That was beautiful. I'm conscious of time.
Mm-hmm.
You got one more there?
Yeah, I do. Now, I don't know.
But before perhaps you read it, I just want to take a note. We've heard, not only we're hearing a range of wonderful poems, but I want to just take a note of the immense amount of activity. You know, we heard about George earlier and his activity with Nikos. I know Pi has been doing it for years in Collective Effort Press. Kathy's here, the Greek Australian Cultural League, and their journal Antipodes. There's a lot of work, there's a lot of labour, a lot of time committed to these kind of literary outputs. Recognizing that as part and parcel of not just poeting, right, but publishing, and then how these publications are available to us across the generations. So a little return then back to Helen Nikos, who, you know, did these, and there's a series of other works. On the second book in our publishing you did with her, right, is to say this really matters. It really matters that there are spaces in which these voices can be published, and then by extension, this is the historian in me and where I sort of started from, is to say it then really matters that there is a place that these works are preserved, right? That you cannot just rely necessarily on these state institutions to collect these stories, to collect these writers, right? This is something over the next course of my journey as a historian, I'll be very much thinking about how do you keep these preserved, maintained for generations ahead. Okay, I say this to then kind of plug. Yeah, exactly. A very, very serious plug is that Angela and George have established, co-founded with a range of other writers and poets, a brilliant online journal called Calliope X, which I recommend you go Google and read their latest issue. And on the 30th later this month at Capers up in Northcote, please come and enjoy another wonderful literary expressive night in which, you know, off the back of it, you know, off the smell of an oily rag, as they say, they you know, it's a fundraising event, let's be honest, but it's important to invest in these outputs. Okay.
Right. And I mean, in
a poem from each of you, and then let's wrap up.
All right.
You got one more there?
Sure. I got two quick excerpts rather than a long poem. The first, and this is by way of kind of what Calliope, of course, the muse of heroic or dramatic poetry, and X, of course, because we're getting her back from the neoclassicists. She says, fuck you, you know. Anyway, the part of this is we're sharing our stuff together and reflecting each other, you know, like stars hanging from Indra's net, all the fragments of mirrors reflecting each other at all points in the universe, right? So in that spirit, I've chosen two poems that resonated with me personally, but also reflect our broader experience. And this one is an excerpt from my favourite poem by Enda Buscan, from his latest book, third collection, I believe, Giramondo. You've got to get a copy of it. I don't want to point you to readings, but I'll point you to paperback books. Yes. Much cooler and much more indie. And this is an excerpt from the opening of that. It's called Get Your Overalls On by Enda Buscan. World War II, Turkey trying to stay out of it, neutral. America wants to bring democracy. Puts pressure. Welcome to NATO. Cold War. Military coup. Hang the Prime Minister. Reform. Workers first allowed to unionize in 1961. The left are getting stronger. Growing class consciousness. Conditions ripening for revolution. America not like this, mate. So, funding right wing. ultranationalists and clerics, Operation Gladio, counter-guerrilla, look it up. Escalation, political violence, assassinations, CIA, May Day massacre. Amongst it all, leftist artists prominent. Musicians singing about social issues, about politics in direct way. A long tradition in folk music now crossing into rock and pop. Not just singing about naive love, but of social conditions, of oppression, of class. The giant presence of Jem Karaja, iconic singer, the Resonator, singing Tamirji Chiraye, 1975. Listen to this song, deep booming voice. The music swells and slows, rock, full of the drama of the streets. The glamorous woman brings her car to a mechanic. An apprentice swoons. Overnight, he thinks of a novel that he's read. The same situation. Beauty falls for a worker. Next morning, brushing his hair, waits, asks boss if he can go without wearing his dirty overalls today. She walks in. He's agog, trying to be smooth. He opens the car door for her. Who's this bum? She snorts. She gets in, stomps on the gas pedal, chokes him with fumes. He's crushed, tears bud. Boss slaps him on the back, and Cem Karaca sings, Unu dedi romanları, işkisin sen işkikal, gi dedi tulumları. Forget the novels. You are a worker. Stay a worker. Get your overalls on. Line repeats 12 times to the end of the song. You are a worker. Stay a worker. Next poem is by a total freakazoid, Georgia Kartas. She works at the Brunswick Bound. And it's called Parthenogenesis. Parthenogenesis is how the Parthenon was born. A virgin sprouts out of her father's crown and births her future city, circled by mountains which birth a limestone hill. Salamanders are the oldest known vertebrates of virgin birth, dating back to the Pliocene. This is the epoch before the epoch when humans first appear. Mary Theotokou, mother of incarnated God, is the first lizard in millions of years to appear human. Salamanders do not perceive the arrow of time. God exists outside of measurable time because God created time and therefore cannot be it or inside it. In 1969, Buffy St. Marie sings, Time itself, the magic length of God. I listen in 2025 and feel the length, and feel that length in tomatoes plucked off the vine and eaten straight away when the fruit is still alive, like a lizard's tail just after the chop. Both grow back on their own. Another thing about salamanders, one snuck into a cart on the feet of an archetype on a throne. Let's call the archetype that earlier virgin. A virgin can also be an unmarried woman, whatever that is. The virgin is a cheerleader. Cheerleaders are bisexual muses and withstand all forms of fire, like salamanders. They hibernate in logs and come out in moments of crisis. A crisis of language occurs in a backyard I no longer have. Negative theology births the seeds I will crown in the sky. A crisis salamanders expurgates the way the dark does. I have made up a word. Salamanders are mainly made of made up things.
Very good.
Okay.
She also
Nikos.
published this book here called If You Want to Be Famous, Write About Your Ethnicity and Take on Some Sex. If I've never been judge a book by its cover, but I bought it purely based on this. Oh, how I laughed.
Nikos, and then Angela, do you want to read one more?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I just want to say one more little thing. These poems came into the world despite the system. And at the time, in the 70s and 80s, we were just saying this before with Pio, there were 10 times more journals, literary journals, than there are today. 10 times. Meanjin just closed.
Yeah.
Right? In those days, every state had 2 or 3 journals. Now there's not even in the country that many. But there were more gatekeepers than ever before, and what they considered was poetic was within a very narrow band. And so the very thing that you thought was not poetry, your life, was not considered poetry, right? It was literally, there wasn't a mistake you made. That's how you were educated. Exactly. To ignore your context, to ignore the vibrancy of the vernacular. And it took the avant-garde to do that in terms of the visual arts, to say, hey, the everyday is as significant as the religious icons and as the royal portraits and as the other allegories of the Renaissance. So to break with that hierarchy of what is considered worthwhile to be depicted, someone had to sort of step out and say, look at this, it has value. Now, that happened because of the artists, first and foremost. But there was another bit of the army that was involved, and that was people like Sneža Gunjev. And Sneža was a pioneer in Australia in terms of promoting the value of this migrant optic and this migrant aesthetic and this migrant content, because she rightly identified that it was expanding the frontiers of our visual, literary, cultural horizons. And the interesting thing that happened at the same time as her writing about this is that she was also informed by French philosophy. I remember I got very seduced by French philosophy, and people like Yorgo and Pio would say, what the fuck are you talking about? You know, what is this? Do we need a microscope to see this stuff?
Again with the Frenchies.
But the value of that French theory was that it valorized the nomadic. It pointed our attention to the hybrid. It talked about process and the liminal, and therefore gave us a vocabulary and a framework to validate that which was excluded from the mainstream. And so that theoretical as well as polemical push that people like Sneža pioneered was incredibly important. As a consequence, in 1984, I wrote a dissertation full of fragments, which I'd probably fail if I submitted today. I'm going to read you the first page. The bricoleur is a hitchhiker. Wandering is the almost absolute negation of order. The migrant is carried away from his point of reference. The bricoleur is transported across and over his point of reference. In his unticketed way, he sort of knows where he's going. For the migrant, safety is when the driver also speaks his language. The sky here is a revenge against solitude. Blue cloud, cloudy blue. It's not America in a far-off future. Maybe it will be the last America of the world. There are the foundations of the extolled lucky country. Now it is not the dream dreamt of, nor the land of plenty. It is an infinity of dances. He travels openly without the sustenance and protection of a schedule. These are not declarations of independence, for no one can be infatuated with such long periods of frustration, and who can ignore the insecurity of unknown solitude? Egon Kuhn said that the refugee must escape and that displacement can lead you nowhere, even into the no man's land of the Antipodes. Thank you.
Thank you. I've got a little poem too, and then we'll
No more secret poems.
not a secret poem. I want to share this poem because of age. There's a context of thinking about forebears generations ahead, where we kind of don't understand and then come to understand. It's by Peter Stresnecki. It's called No. A Bag of Oranges. When my mother and I arrived at Central Station from the migrant hostel in Parkes to begin our lives as a family in suburbia, my father met us on the platform with a bag of oranges as a gift. It was 9:51. We travelled to Regent's Park on the southwestern line with boxes and suitcases securely tied with straps and ropes. A large trunk had been brought beforehand with my father from Parkes. There was much talk about life in Sydney and what a prosperous future lay ahead of us. On the way to Regent's Park, a bag of oranges laid stacked on top of the baggage like the rest of my parents' hopes. I tried to imagine them in the brown paper bag, glowing warmly in the dark. Were they soft and sweet, delicious? Or were they sour and hard? Though the oranges were eaten and our journey into the suburbs began, I never understood why my father brought them as a welcoming gift. Our home had lino on the floor and there were newspapers covering the windows. During the day, my mother would take them down so the rooms got plenty of sunlight. Furniture consisted of a table and chairs, a sideboard and 2 mattresses, all of which were inherited with the house. For weeks we slept on the floor, light globes hung under plain glass shades. My parents talked excitedly of the future. Nearly 40 years later, visiting Poland, I saw a man giving an orange as a gift, one of many he'd brought back in his car from Spain. When I asked why, he replied, "The weather here. It's too cold to grow them. Have one. It's the fruit of the sun." Okay, Angela, and then we'll wrap up.
I'll try and I picked one. I call it polyphony, so it's multiple voices, and obviously, just having read Pios, it felt appropriate. And this is an oral story that was told to me, and I've tried to capture it as it happened. Happened to my mum and her cousin and her sister on a tram in the 1960s, and it begins with an epigraph from a film that you can YouTube it and see it. It's still there. It's a 1960s film. So I'll begin with the epigraph and then I'll go straight into the narrative. It's called The Good Citizens of Melbourne. Trams are the good citizens of Melbourne. There are nearly 700 trams on Melbourne streets. Looking after them takes a lot of men, cleaners, overhaulers, tradesmen of all sorts. Citizen Tram, a 1960s film by the Melbourne and Metropolitan Tramways Board. Sitting next to my young mother is Dina, her sister, with eyes men fall into. She's older and focused on getting them to work, making sure they don't miss stop 20. Facing her but almost falling into her lap is Thelema, her cousin, with arms and legs that don't stop talking. Did you hear about Effie? Yes, you know her. She's the one with the glass eye, the one that works the zipper machine. She's 15, younger than me. She looks 50. She has a Bruxenia. He's at least 30. Her parents want to get rid of her because of the Zimia with the gelato shop boy. With a slight lean of her head away from the window, Dina intervenes. Effie shouldn't be forced. It's criminal. Her parents are Varvari. Then my mother, who is a mere 15 herself, says maybe she's better off. Who wants to be sklavos for the rich man and his needle and thread machine? Dina, Thelema, young mum, are a trio of handbags, lunch boxes, orange, apricot, lavender skirts, shirts with wide white collars showing neck bones, smiles of modest pink lipstick, earrings that clasp the ear tight, knees protruding with pent-up bursts of freedom as they speak in a flurry of Cypriot Greek on a busy tram heading to a factory where young women make fashion for others. The tram halts before stop 20. The driver turns his mouth into a fist. On this tram, we speak English. If you keep up with your gibberish, you can get off at the next stop. The language hovers over their heads like a thought cloud of orexy, dark, spiralling, sending them down into a well where there are no windows to see, plum trees, magpies, milk bars. Each day they caught that tram, they renewed their vow of silence.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. We're going to wrap it up there, folks. History, poetry, diaspora. There's a lot going on to kind of move with. I hope, please have a conversation with us afterwards. We'll be around. We know most of you, but thank you for coming and persevering for the last 2 hours.
Andonis, can you sneak in one or two questions from the audience?
Okay, sure.
Dina?
I'm going to make it very brief. Today I communicated with Kathy and I told her that I was correcting over 40, like 50-page essays till 7:30. You were all, each of you, read so beautifully, you spoke so exquisitely. Andoni, you framed that so well that I could talk about these issues to the morning. I'm completely rejuvenated after hearing you. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. I want to share with everyone the first thing that Pio said to me. I was 30 years old, was a new academic at RMIT and thought I was really something and going places. And we bumped into each other on Lonsdale Street. And you probably don't remember it, Pio, but Pio turned to me and said, "My language is more important than Shakespeare's." And I remember at the time being very affronted. I was doing an honours thesis on Shakespeare. And I remember thinking, oh, goodness, Now, all these years later, you were quite right, Pio. You were really quite right. What you were doing with the language was what Shakespeare had done. Very much so, or as my husband would say, the colonial construct that is Shakespeare. I would love to know the place of this linguistic complexity in your work. I'd love to hear some thoughts on that. Or I guess using different languages or things,
like polyglossia and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ange?
You go first. All right.
Ange?
A bit of what I've read from Pio's, it's the language that we hear. It's capturing the reality of our existence. It is, for me, it's the Cypriot dialect, which I feel a real connection with more than the Greek language, which is quite frightening because it's dying. The Cypriot dialect is dying tremendously. So there's beautiful various variations of glossa, and within our the dominant culture is this sense of what is English, but the English is just so many things. It's just very.
What is it that's impelling you to want to preserve it? These are thoughts I've been having because now I'm older. What is it that's impelling you?
What is it? So Konstantina's asking, what is impelling us to preserve the language? I mean, I think part of it, I can't explain. It's a compulsion. It is, I was just thinking about today the fact that a lot of my earlier poems are very musical. So, Synopsis Giriagi is imbued in one of my poems, even though I don't even bring up the song. It is, maybe it's the advocate in me, maybe it's the the poet in me, that all poets, we all endeavour to somehow capture our, as you pointed out, Shakespeare did it, our very existence, our reality. It's imperative. The archives don't do it justice.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Also, the older generation are all dying. And there are parents, and they went through what they went through. And for me, it's capturing their lives and giving them a voice.
Yeah. And maybe, that's a really good point, Hadigli. As we get older, it becomes more and more imperative, because we realise, we're so busy in our teenage years being rebellious, and then, many years later we think, geez, they were right about the language, and on a personal level with my mum, who's now regressed to a point where she was pretty good with her English, but now she only communicates in the Cypriot dialect because she's got advanced Alzheimer's. And, I'm holding on, and I'm trying to sort of grab as much as I can before she's non-verbal. So, yeah.
I think in many ways it's not a conscious thing. Like this idea of preservation, as though we're preserving national buildings or collecting stamps or, something, artifactual. I think it's, all of us are, living archives of language, and it's, the language of our bodies, the language of memory, by way of dream or by way of imagination. It's all swimming around in this cosmic soup, So if we talk about, language and diaspora, or polyglossia and diaspora, it comes out in this is just the dynamics of consciousness and of your sensorium. To consciously write a diasporic poem, it's probably going to be shit, because you're going to a formula, or you're writing for somebody else's ear. You're not using it to, make sense of, again, that leap from our parents' generation. Of course, it's become almost a platitude to say, whatever we've done, it's on their shoulders. Of course it is, but it's not to kind of turn around and say, thank you in some kind of, cockamamie hallmark way. It's, you're carrying it on in your way. Of course, our parents' generation and all those struggles, it's imbricated in there. Of course, my poems are going to be diasporic poems because that's the circumstances of their composition. It's not, I don't have to write consciously, my yaya's hands like paper, kneading the zimari when she's making the vasilopita, and and this will alleviate some middle class white liberal guilt. When they kind of come to the readings, they go, oh, it was so powerful, about your yaya. Okay, who cares? But yeah,
Can I just add then about, as a reader, to identify a Greek word that's not written in Greek, for example, Paya can do that really amazingly. I've also seen Paya play with Greek lettering for me to reinterpret a language that I've struggled to grasp, right?
Yeah.
So the multiple creative ways that poets can play with structures of language to allow us to have a better sense of the processes of these diasporic worlds, right, is immensely important, right? I'll just with a little thing to say, this semester I brought Angela into one of my seminars. And Angela, like a few of them have picked they've written essays about you now.
Oh my
No. But the point being is that I expose them to forms of language that are not formal, that are not contained within how we're educated to write. And then they see very quickly, with any background, right, that there's something in this. There are many histories to access within this one couple of lines, right? And then they can cross-culture interpret, namely, at the same time. I say it's extremely important then to recognise that playfulness of language, and Paya, you're a master at this. I mean, the ability to bring humour, right, into the serious realms of our traumas, right, takes us into a space that allows the next generation to move on with confidence, right? Not to neglect that past, like George just said. Within a generation, we've all become well-educated doctors with PhDs, right? But to say then that when we're gonna struggle with those taboos, with those hidden, often untalked about things that hover around in our community that we do not give attention to, but yet fundamentally construct how we might operate through these worlds of the do's and the don'ts, of what Yaya would accept and what she wouldn't accept, right? They're very important cultural expressions that allow us to get into more accurate, more welcoming, right, reflections onto ourselves, right?
All right, we just might finish.
Pie.
I'd just like to make a couple. No, don't need that. Just make a couple of points. Is that this is still, the whole discussion has been based on some kind of nationality hyphenated amalgam, which to me plays the ethnic card, and I detest the ethnic card. I think you have to start with a better proposition, that is, what does the working class contain? And it contains all these different languages, different types of people from all over the world, including an amalgam of dialect writing. Because I don't just write Greek dialect writing. I create an amalgam, just like C.J. Dennis had created an amalgam. And so to me, if you want to get away from that ethnic tag, which has been institutionalised literally in all these writing classes. The next point is, Angela, I love what you did in the reading of my poems, so thank you. But at the same time, you said you see nostalgia in it. And to me, I object. I object because I don't play nostalgia. I've been writing for 55 years. I wrote my poems as I lived it. You come along 50 years later and say, oh look, an old Greek cafe. Now that might be nostalgia for you, but it's not what I did.
Yeah, I can see that.
Mike, just finishing.
I want to second both of those points. And my parents, one was Dimitri Tsaloumas, and he was married to a German. I'm just wondering how many of you children up there have got both Greek parents?
It's a very good question, right? I'll speak for myself.
I spend time between two different countries.
Right.
Sorry, three.
That's why it's a very good question, and
I'm
since
not a poet at all.
yeah, no, I think it's a question we've really got to ask ourselves within the context of community about that, particularly because I want to just say, on my father's side, I stem from Castellaresians who come here in the 20s. My mother comes here when she's 16 from Cyprus. They're completely different Greeks, right? They almost share no real history in terms of migration story and things. No, but the point, but it's a really important thing then to say. And then they did this thing, which I talked to Nikos the other day about this, and to say, I really don't know post-war Greeks that did this. They moved to Canberra in 88. They moved to Canberra, and that's where I grew up. So Melbourne, so the point I'm trying to say is that the mobilities of our lives explored through these expressions, and as Pi says, as we lived it, if you will, right? It's very important to say it's not a story of A to B. It's not a story of one culture marrying into another culture. It comes back to that sort of process. So thank you for sharing, right? Well, thank you for coming.
I was also going to say that my father detested the word multiculturalism. He detested that sort of...
As we do here.
Absolutely, he couldn't stand it.
That's true. I remember you now. Yeah, I've been to your house and we've had many times drunk the wine and all that, as did Pio. But were you listening at the beginning, Pio, when we were talking? Are you listening now? Pay attention. Wake up. We started this conversation by challenging the ethnic category. We started this conversation by saying that what we're going to focus on is not that we're either from Greece or from Australia, or that we're this new happy synthesis called the multicultural Australian, right? We started the whole conversation about the relational value of the hyphen, right? The fact that you're neither nor or both and at the same time. And that's the way in which we're trying to articulate a more cosmopolitan aesthetic that your father embraced, and a more vernacular language which is full of the grit and context and content of the everyday that you articulated. And so the whole conversation did not start from the premise of elevating a particular ethnicity, nor did anyone at any stage believe that multiculturalism was the panacea for everything. And then let me finish. Let me finish. So Antigone was the first multicultural arts officer, and she knew that there's a difference between seeing something as a neat little category that can contain everything, and the difference between that and a lever for opening up doors that enable possibilities that otherwise would never get enabled. Like your father and all these poets, for good or for bad, would not even been seen as visible if it wasn't for somebody to create a lever. Now, we might resent that when it becomes a ghetto. We resent it when it becomes an enclosure and a neat little category to place somebody. And your father was very bitter about many things to do with the hierarchies in the literary world, who included him in their anthologies and vice versa. And he had very good reasons, because they were gatekeepers.
He used the established canon to do anthologies. He did not upset the apple cart, at all. The anthology he sends off to Greeks to have a look at is full of the Australian canon and boring as shit.
It's up there if you want to have a look at it. It's Jeff Page and Chris Wallace Crabbe are in there.
But that's why perhaps, Pi, you were awarded while you're still kicking. The point. But the point being, right, is that you offer us something new. You offer us something that we're still writing with. When you performed...
I'm at the same time as these people. I'm at the same time. I'm writing at the same time. I'm on SBS in 1979, on 1980 when the SBS first starts. I win their awards, and Tsaloumas and Kefala and all that play the ethnic cards, and they get the grants, they get the money, they get the anthologies, they get the books, they send it through, and they don't give a shit about what's on the shop floor.
That's not great. That's extreme. Come on. I understand that it wasn't as black and white as that.
Why not? I felt it was.
And thought at times that some poets should never part. They should keep their works to themselves and enjoy it and not share with anyone It's a real artist.
Look, I mean, it's a broad church. It's a broad church, so there's room for everyone. But you know, I still reserve the right to say your palm stinks.
Did you reject the prize, the Patrick White Prize, or did you take it because you're now part of the canon and you're now part of the established hierarchy, which people can come to and look at as a model in the same way as people look at Antigone and at Tsaloumas and at you as models to build on. They may not have had your approach or your politics, but they were there as groundbreakers.
But
I speak to someone of that generation.
Did you know about the Patrick White Award? You can't apply for it. Your publisher can't apply for it.
But you accepted it.
They ring you up and they say, would you like some money? Yeah, bring it over.
yeah,
Ultimately, you're no different from them.
no.
Guys, we don't need to go down this road.
Please, guys, it's getting
We
close to
don't need
midnight.
to go down this road.
Okay.
that,
Look, no, but please, we're going to bring things to an end. Thank you very much. It's a very intense discussion.
Can I just say something? I just want to say that Paolo's defence, I've known him for more than 40 years, and
Congratulations.
I was with him when he refused over and over again any grants. He did not ever apply, and he refused money over and over and over again. And that's Paolo.
Nick,
Okay.
Can I just say before we wrap up and to say, if you read the brief for tonight, right? There's no Greek. It's diaspora.
Yeah.
I'm pushing, right, in my position here at the university to think really seriously about this term, right? It do not be contained in any ethno-nationalist, ethnic-specific category. And this is to say, it's a different working class. Okay, all right. But then within that pile, let me just share this, because I hope you'll walk away with some goodness from this comment. Is to say, the last year or the year before, when you launched the tour, and I'm there and I'm watching, and the crowd that's in that room, right, was the most diverse crowd of people. By extension, the students that I'm teaching have no idea about Kefala. They have no idea about Tsaloumas. I have to tell them, you're there. And the next generation are picking you up. And they're reading you, and they're buying the books that you're throwing into readings, right? And they're identifying with it. Now, you can't say that doesn't speak to something. And they will continue. They will continue.
For 10 years, I hadn't been anthologized. It took 40 years for them to catch up.
But it's your work. You're doing the labour for it. I get that. 100% get that.
Well, don't tell me about sort of the next generations, adopting them.
Okay. All right.
All right. Let's bring proceedings to a close.
Thank you to the Greek Australian Cultural League. Thank you to the Greek community. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. Big round of applause for everyone, please. Thank you.
Okay. Just say that last week, UNESCO actually voted that the Greek language is a world language. And I'm part of Andonis.
I just wanted to say to